The 4th of July, the birthday of my country, and more importantly, the time for fireworks, beer, and cookouts. Independence Day is the largest civic holiday in the United States. Every year, millions of people travel all across the country to celebrate the birth of the United States. But did you know that technically the United States was already legally separated from Great Britain on July the 4th, 1776? So, when did the U.S. actually become an independent state? How did the 4th become Independence Day? And what other options could have been chosen to celebrate the nation's birth? Let's talk about it. Before we start talking about dates, let's quickly discuss how the United States, or I guess the 13 colonies at the time, pushed for independence. I should note here that we are not going to be talking about the militaristic actions of either side during the American Revolution. This video is focused exclusively on the political and social side of things. I will leave some of my favorite resources on the Revolutionary War down in the description for you to check out after this video if you want more information on that side of things. Politically, the first thing we really need to look at is the Stamp Act Congress. That Congress was a gathering of representatives from 9 different British colonies in the Americas, called in response to the passing of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was the first attempt by the British Parliament to directly tax the colonies. This act required that many printed materials, including newspapers, books, court documents, and so on, carry a stamp. That stamp had to be purchased from an agent of the British government. You see, at the time, the British were involved in ventures all across the world, and that pretty quickly racked up a bill. This new revenue was supposed to go towards paying for troops stationed in colonies across the world, but mainly in the Americas. Remember that at this point in history, Britain was still engaged in the European Great Game, and one opponent in that game was the French, who just so happened to own quite a few colonies for themselves in the Americas. I'm sure you can draw your own conclusions about why the British government felt it so important to station troops in the Americas. In any case, this tax proved to be deeply unpopular among the colonies. In fact, just 3 months after the bill had been passed in March of 1765, the Massachusetts Assembly drafted a letter which was sent to their sister colonies calling for a gathering of representatives to draft and implement a response to the newly enacted tax. Eventually, 9 colonies sent delegates to this Congress. Those colonies were Massachusetts, of course, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina. Only 4 of Britain's colonies in what would become the United States did not send delegates. Virginia and Georgia were prevented from doing so by their governors, New Hampshire was having a financial crisis, and North Carolina had no assembly in session. The Congress eventually passed the first Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This declaration contained 14 main points, yet notably did declare loyalty to the Crown and subordination to Parliament. The document didn't really have much success. While the Stamp Act would be repealed, it was in large part thanks to the merchant class of Britain itself protesting against the act, rather than the actions of the Congress. However, this does mark an important point in the march towards American independence. This was really one of the first organized political actions undertaken by the British colonies of America, and several of the Congress's members, including men like James Otis, John Rutledge, and John Morton, would go on to be leaders on the political side of American independence. So now we jump forward in time to September 5th, 1774. On this date, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This Congress had been called in response to the Boston Tea Party and the passing of the Intolerable Acts. The Tea Party is arguably one of the most famous events, certainly in American history, but possibly even world history. It had been called in reaction to the passing of the Tea Act of 1773. This act was meant to save the struggling British East India Company by giving them access to duty-free imports on their tea. While this was all well and good, the issue here was that if the tea was imported into America, then the colonists would be forced to pay the townshed duty on tea. The townshed duties had been a series of laws passed by Parliament in the 1760s, which placed import duties, a kind of tax, on several popular goods, including glass, paints, paper, and, of course, tea, coming into the American colonies. Most of these taxes had been repealed after widespread and sometimes very violent protests across the colonies. However, the tax on tea had remained, mostly as a demonstration that Parliament still held the right to directly tax the colonies. It had not been a huge issue in the intervening years, as most of the tea in North America, about 85% or so, was actually Dutch tea smuggled into American ports and sold without the additional tax. However, The Tea Act seriously cracked down on that smuggled tea and gave the East India Company the right to ship their tea directly to North America. In basically a repeat of the protests before the Stamp Act Congress, a massive wave of protests kicked off in the colonies, but specifically in Massachusetts. Here, many colonists boarded tea ships belonging to the East India Company and threw their cargo overboard. In response to this protest, the Intolerable Acts were passed. These were 4 acts passed right around the same time. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston to any ships until the colonists paid for the tea that they had destroyed. The Massachusetts Government Act took away the charter for the colony and essentially gave governing power directly to the governor of the colony, parliament, or the king. The Administration of Justice Act allowed the royal governor to order trials of royal officials accused of wrongdoing to be held in Great Britain or somewhere else in the empire instead of in Massachusetts. On the surface, this was only to be used if the government felt the official couldn't receive a fair trial inside of Massachusetts, but in practice was essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for any royal official accused of wrongdoing. And lastly, the Quartering Act, which actually applied to all American colonies, allowed colonial governors to house soldiers in any building they liked if suitable quarters could not be found. This last act is a bit of an open-ended question though, as many believe this meant troops could be housed in private homes, but much of the modern research actually points to unoccupied buildings as being the main target. In any case, these acts proved to be too much, and the First Continental Congress was called. At this Congress, representatives from every colony except Georgia, which was still more loyal than not, met to form a united response to the Intolerable Acts. The first declaration made were the Suffolk Resolves. This document had actually been drawn up prior by several Massachusetts counties and urged the following: a boycott of British imports, curtailing exports, refusal to use British products, paying no obedience to the Massachusetts Government Act or the Boston Port Bill, demanding resignations from those appointed to positions under the Massachusetts Government Act, refusing payment of taxes until the Massachusetts Government Act was repealed, supporting a colonial government in Massachusetts free of royal authority until the Intolerable Acts were repealed, and urging the colonies to raise militia of their own people. The Congress also passed the Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress, which was similar to the previous declaration passed by the Stamp Act Congress. This act further denounced the Intolerable Acts and really began to raise an issue about taxation without representation, which is the most repeated chant of my childhood education. The Congress further passed the petition to the king, which again proclaimed to the king that if things went back to the way they were before the implementation of the Tea and Intolerable Acts, then the colonies would remain loyal. It really should be noted here, though, that at this Congress the delegates were far from united. Some, like Joseph Galloway, John Dickinson, John Jay, and Edward Rutledge, were more focused on getting Parliament to repeal the acts and then bringing about reconciliation, while others, like Patrick Henry, Roger Sherman, Samuel Adams, and John Adams, were much more interested in something closer to independence, with Patrick Henry believing that the Congress needed to develop their own system of government independent of Great Britain. In the end, though, reconciliation won the day, and the First Continental Congress did not call for independence outright. Instead, they were much more focused on the repeal of the Intolerable Acts, the Tea Act, and in recognition of their rights as British citizens. The last act of the Congress was to declare that if the grievances were not addressed, then they would again meet the following year, and invitations were sent out to join that Congress to the colonies that had not joined the first one. Those included Quebec, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, Georgia, East Florida, and West Florida. And now we get to the real meat of the political side of the revolution, the Second Continental Congress. It was once again held in Philadelphia. This time, representatives from all 13 colonies were represented, although Georgia again kind of held out and only really sent representatives once a provincial Congress was created, which was kind of like a legislative body created to go against the royal government in the colony. In any case, by the time the Congress convened on May 10, 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord had already occurred, and war was coming whether the Congress wanted it or not. It's at this point that the Congress began to serve as a de facto federal government for the colonies. They raised militias, began to direct military strategy, appointed diplomats, and began writing declarations in response to British actions. This is probably the first date that you can make a decent argument for as Independence Day. At this point, the Congress was for all intents and purposes a distinct government from Britain, and frankly, they fulfilled basically every requirement of a state. They had their own government, they had their own army, they controlled their own territory. Hell, they even started to take loans from other European countries. Further, on June 14, 1775, Congress voted to create the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as the commanding general. At this point, the Congress was inarguably its own state. While still disorganized and in its infancy, it was certainly operating as a state. On July 6 of 1775, the Congress approved the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This document, written by Thomas Jefferson, was essentially an explainer on why the colonies had rebelled. Jefferson again pointed out how Parliament had been trying to extend its jurisdiction directly into the colonies without giving anything in return. The issue of representation was again brought forward, as was the passing of the Intolerable Acts, along with the British reaction to the colonies' petitions for redress of grievances. It basically summed up the past 10 or so years of political history in the colonies into one easy-to-read document. Interestingly though, the document does stress that the colonists did not yet seek independence. Instead, the colonists had taken up arms, quote, in defense of the freedom that is our birthright and which we ever enjoyed until the late violation of it, and will lay them down when hostilities shall cease on the part of the aggressors, end quote. And that really is the main problem with many of these earlier dates. It's pretty obvious that at this point the Continental Congress was not quite ready to call for full independence. Instead, this war was viewed as closer to a civil war. It's hard to say what exactly would have happened if the two sides had simply agreed to revert things back to the way they were before Parliament passed all of their acts, but it's quite possible that even this close to the passing of the Declaration of Independence, the two sides could have found some way to de-escalate the situation. The situation was further compounded with the passing of the Olive Branch Petition. This petition, created by John Dickinson, was an attempt to again reconcile with the Crown. This petition was written directly to King George and passed on July 5, 1775. Again, the petition claimed that the colonies were still loyal to the Crown and did not want independence. Instead, Dickinson claimed that the colonies only wanted more equal trade and tax regulations. He asked the king to step in and create a settlement between the colonies and Great Britain itself. This, of course, would start with the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. King George, though, refused to read it, and further reiterated that the colonists were traitors to the Crown and must be put down. It's really at this point that sentiment began to really turn. Most colonists and the leading political figures of the Congress began to realize that the choice was either total submission to Great Britain and its parliament, or to fight for complete independence. I probably do not have to tell you what choice they made. By May of the next year, the tide had turned, and the Congress began to advise the colonial governments to appoint officials inclined towards independence, and even called for all oaths of allegiance to be thrown off and the authority of the Crown to be suppressed. On May 15th, the government of Virginia instructed its delegation at the Congress to propose a resolution calling for independence and to begin approaching other European states for aid and alliance. This all boiled over on June 7th, 1776, when Richard Henry Lee, a member of that Virginia delegation, introduced a resolution before the Congress. This resolution, eventually known as the Lee Resolution, called for Congress to declare the colonies as independent, to form foreign alliances, and to prepare a plan to install a new government across the colonies. As you can probably tell, this resolution was essentially just what the Virginia government had told Lee to do. The resolution passed on July 2nd, 1776. The entire resolution was only a few lines long and read, quote, "Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and appropriation." However, while this was technically the beginning of the American state, the real Declaration of Independence would be famously issued only 2 days later, on July 4th, 1776. This declaration, written mostly by Thomas Jefferson, but technically under the purview of a committee of 5 people, was a formal explanation of why the colonies had decided to declare independence. Remember, by this point the Revolutionary War had already been going on for over a year, and just 2 days before, the actual legal separation of the colonies had happened. So, why is the 4th accepted as Independence Day? Well, for one, any time prior to July 2nd, 1776 could be argued to be in a sort of limbo period, where the colonies weren't independent but were more engaged in a civil war. It was a commonly held belief at the time that eventually the colonies would rejoin with the British Empire, and that the colonies would remain ultimately loyal to the crown. So despite the Second Continental Congress functioning largely as an independent government, and the colonies being at war with Britain, independence had not yet happened, nor was it even really a goal of the Congress. Really, the only date that has any sort of competition with the 4th would be July 2nd. Again, it was on this day that the Congress really declared themselves independent, and it can be argued that it was from that point on that the United States, though not called that yet, began to operate as its own country. But the reality is that the Declaration of Independence was simply a masterpiece. It was beautifully written, summed up everything that had occurred up to that point, and explained why the colonies had declared themselves independent. To be frank, the Lee Resolution was not grand enough, and it didn't have the same staying power as the Declaration of Independence did. To add to this, the Declaration of Independence was widely distributed throughout the colonies, while the Lee Resolution was mostly confined to history as a legislative document. This is all despite John Adams claiming that, quote, "the 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance, by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." End quote. In the end, Adams was wrong, and July the 4th was quickly adopted, nearly from the onset of independence, as the country's birthday, and it has been celebrated as such for over 200 years. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. This was something a little bit special for the holiday. It was also a bit of a quick and dirty summary, as to truly document many of these events, I would be here for hours, but hopefully it was a coherent enough narrative. This is also not one of my specialties, so definitely feel free to correct me down in the comments if I got anything wrong. If you have any comments or questions on the video, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.